welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Bonnie Pesakov's children in honor of her birthday. To sponsor an episode or support the podcast, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or see the links and information in the show's notes below. Please check out the new Svarim Chatter YouTube channel, where parts 1 and 2 of a video tour of my library is up, with more forthcoming, as well as a review of a sefer is up already. Please subscribe and comment there. And if you have more ideas of what you would like to see on the YouTube channel, please email me and let me know. Please also subscribe to the Svarim Chatter Substack, which is like a blog, which gets emailed directly to you. Also, if you're interested in writing any essays or reviews of Svarim or books or anything of the sort, please email me as well. And there's a link for the Substack in the show's notes as well. There also is a link for the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where the admin-only chat is where I post new books and Svarim and other related information. And finally, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite listening platform, whether it's 24/6, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And if you use Apple, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast. That does help the podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Jordan Penkower, and we'll be discussing his brand new book, which is a collection of his articles over the years, titled Toldos Pirush Rashi Tanach, published by Mossad Bialik in their Asufot series. Thank you, Professor Penkower, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's first start off, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, here's a short biography. My education, most of it was at Yeshiva University. I did a BA Mathematics, then an MA in Math at the Belfer Graduate School of Sciences, and I did another MA in Bible at the Bernard Revel Graduate School. Then I did Smicha at Reitz at the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, with the Rav for 2 years there. And then I went to Israel and I did my PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Bible. Following all that education, many years, I then went on to teach at Bar Ilan University, where I became professor of Bible. I've guest lectured in several universities in the States, like Harvard, Yale, University of Pennsylvania, University of Maryland, Bernard Graduate School, NYU, Rutgers, etc. Also, I've had the great privilege of traveling widely to do research in manuscripts and Torah scrolls in libraries and private collections. In Russia and St. Petersburg, in the United States, like JTS, YU, New York Public Library, and especially in Europe, in many countries and libraries. Just for a few examples, in England, in London, the British Library, Val Madonna Collection, Sofer Collection, Cambridge at the University Library, and Trinity College, Oxford, Scotland, Ireland, Italy, and numerous cities, Rome, Vatican, Florence, Siena, Parma, Padua, etc. Also in Spain, also in Germany, like Berlin, Leipzig, Wolfenbüttel, Munich. And of course, in addition to actually seeing all these manuscripts live in the places, I've had the good fortune of, since I live in Israel, having the great Institute of Microfilms of Hebrew Manuscripts, where they have like 100,000 microfilms of manuscripts all around the world, so I can check out anything I would like at any time.
Okay, and so as you mentioned, actually you didn't mention this, but your PhD was on the Mekayos Gedolos, the original Bomberg edition. Fascinating. Maybe one day we'll do a podcast episode on that, and that's something. But that was never published as a book, right? That's just been
that's in several libraries around the world. They have my copy of my doctorate. A lot of people have been pushing me to put it out as a book, but I was busy with other things. that may be. We may come back to that yet.
Yeah, that would be a great thing. And like I said, hopefully we'll get to a podcast episode about that, because there's so much there. But this right now is your years and years of work. You've worked on Rashi and Rashi on Tanach, and now you've put everything together into one volume. Really nice. And I think it's important. I think where we can start with about Rashi and Tanach. I would assume most listeners familiar with Rashi on Tanach, on Torah for sure, on Nach, very familiar with Rashi. But what maybe they're not so familiar with is, we have a printed text. You pull out a chumash, most chumash has Rashi, but not necessarily everything in there is Rashi. And how did it even get there? And what's the manuscript, tradition, where the manuscripts come from? So I think the first thing, though, to ask you is, you started off in Mekres Gedolos, you've been working on different things. How did you become interested in Rashi on Tanakh, and that you've worked so much on it?
Okay, so here's the story. Several decades ago, I was doing research on Bible manuscripts in Masorah, and I was interested in many lists in the Masorah. One of the famous lists is what we call Beit Betrei Lishnei, cases of words that appear twice in the Tanakh, each case having a different meaning. There's a different list, Beit Bechad Lishan, that words that appear twice in the Tanakh with only one meaning in both. But I was interested in that other list of words that appear twice but have a different meaning. For example, the word agur, right? Agur could mean fear, but also in Mishlei, Divrei Agur Ben Yeker, that's the name of a person. So that's one word, agur. It only appears twice in Tanakh with two different meanings. So this list has like about 99 words. Some say the original list had about 80 words. I was also interested at that time to know if the medieval scholars, like the exegetes, like Rashi, Radak, and the rest of them, and also the grammarians, how much did they pay attention to this Masoretic list when it came to the exegesis, when you're looking at these words? For example, there's another list there of a word called minit, mem yud nun yud taf. So there's a word that appears in Shoftim, and in Shoftim it's clear that it's a place name. It says that Yiftach smote the people of Ammon from Boach ad Boach HaMinit. So that's clearly a place name. But it appears one more time in Yechezkel. And in Yechezkel, it's not 100% sure if it's a place name or not. And so I was interested in knowing, is this a place name or not? So I looked into this a little further. Then I saw, when I looked at it very carefully, it seemed to me very much that Yechezkel's place, it's in chapter 27, that it seems to be a place name, and it talks about chitei minit, the wheat of minit. And then I found that in Divrei Yamim Bet, that again we're talking about Ammon, and Ammon gave to the Jewish king. It talks to them also a huge quantity of chitim from minit. So here we go again. We have the word minit, and in Yechezkel it's talking about chitei minit. So it seems that the pshat in Yechezkel of chitei minit is wheat from this place minit, and it must be apparently special chitim, and that's why they mention it now. So that's what I thought was pshat. So I said, let me look at Rashi. So and when I was doing it in those days, there was no Mikrot Gedol Taketer, and there was no Ala Torah. This is way back. All you had was Mikrot Gedol of Varsha of 1860, 1866, the standard edition. I open it up, and here's what I find in Rashi. Rashi opens up, and he says, Mini, Shem Makom Shechiter Yafot. This is a place name which has a good special wheat. And he brings the proof text of Shoftim. So here's Rashi giving me simple pshat. That's great. Then Rashi says the next sentence. Umedrash Agadah, but according to a certain Agadah, it means chitim shenim karim b'minyan. So in Agadic stuff, it's not a name of a place. It's from the language of minyan. Okay. Then Rashi brings Targum Yonatan, and he says chitei de richush, and that word is not so common, richush. And then you get an explanation. Oh, that means minyanim harbei. And how do you know it means minyan harbei? And then Rashi brings a laz, a famous thing. He calls it trokesh, which means like a cluster. And then he says, because in the psikta we have leah rachusha bebanim. So since Rashi saw in Chazal this word of richush meaning a lot, many, so he then said that's how you explain the Targum Yonatan. So I'm very happy with Rashi. I have a pshat. He brings me a medrash. He brings me a Targum Yonatan. He explains the Targum Yonatan. And then all of a sudden I fell off my chair because the next sentence in Rashi reads like this. Velo yadati mahu. Hello? What do you mean, lo yadati mahu? You just told me what's pshat. You just told me what's the medrash. You just told me what Targum Yonasan, and you explain the Targum Yonasan based on Chazal, and then you tell me lo yadati mahu? So I knew something was not good with Rashi. Then Rashi continues. Bipi Rebbe Shimon matzati. And then he brings from this Rebbe Shimon an alternate text for the Targum Yonasan. Instead of richush, he has something dechushla, an alternate word, and he explains this alternate word. Fine, again. And then he says, Vani Omer, it must mean minyanei ocher. Okay, so now, again, this is the first time I'm really getting sort of like a complicated Rashi here, because I have a Rashi that's telling me pshat, it's telling me medrash, he's telling me Targum Yonatan, and then he says, Lo yadati ma'u. How could Rashi say yodati ma'u? So what did I do? I said, listen, I'm an old hand at manuscripts. I'm in a machon tatzlume kitvei yad. Let's look at some manuscripts. So I go into the machon, and in those days, this is way before computers. So they had a beautiful card catalog based on authors, based on chiburim, based on places and everything. So using that card catalog, I located 17 manuscripts of Rashi on Yechezkel. And then what did I do? Then I found the following. In 3 of the manuscripts, how did I have Rashi? I had Rashi saying the pshat, saying the medrash, saying Targum Yonatzad richush, and the very next line said Velo yadati mahu. And that was the end of the Rashi. So this was the original text of Rashi. In the original text of Rashi, Rashi brought the Targum Yonasan and did not know what it meant. And that was the end of it. So much so for 3 manuscripts. I kept on looking in the manuscripts, and then I found another 4 manuscripts. And in the 4 manuscripts, after he brings the Targum Yonasan, he brings the explanation. The explanation based on the psikta. Oh, the Targum Yonasan means minyanim harbei. And that was the end of those manuscripts. In other words, according to these manuscripts, I don't need lo yadati mahu. Why not? Because Rashi, by this time, found the psikta and understood what the Targum Yonasan was. So here I have Rashi 1 and Rashi 2. Rashi 1, the original Rashi, when he wrote it, he didn't know the Targum Yonasan. He didn't know what the word richush meant. So he ended it, lo yadati mahu. And you found that in some manuscripts. In other manuscripts, by the time he kept on doing more research, he found the Chazal, and so now he dropped the lo yadati mahu, and he explained it. Lovely. Okay, I was very happy. I got Rashi 1 and Rashi 2. That's a little bit of toldot. Then I found some more manuscripts. I found another 7 manuscripts. Interesting. After it had Velo yadati mahu, then we had the following text. Ani shmaya motzati. Not mipi Rebbe Shimon motzati. Not Shimon with Shimem Ayin and something, and Shmaya Shimem Ayin. Reb Shmaya, we know, is a student of Rashi. He was a student and also was Sofer. And what happened was, when Rashi couldn't figure out what the Targum Yonasan was, richush was, Shmaya did a little research and he found another text of this Targum Yonasan. He said, look, Rashi, I found, instead of richush, I found the chushla, and I can give you this explanation. And it continues, Vani Omer, that's Shmaya telling you that it means Menyanim Harbe. So what we have here is, if you're following me, we had Rashi 1, Lo Yadati. Then I have a student of his, Shmaya, explaining what it meant, because he based it on a different text. I'll tell you something else. I continued looking at the manuscripts, and this is fascinating. I found another student, a student by the name of Shmuel Bereb Perigoris. Not too many people know his name, but you can find it in Grossman's book on Chachmei Tzorfas HaRishonim. And Shmuel Bereb Perigoris, he doesn't go with the alternate text of Richush and Chushla. He says, I can explain what that Richush is. I'll use what we have, what we call metathesis. I'll switch the letters. Instead of Richush, I'll call it Chursha. Chursha is like a Ya'ar. It's like a forest. So he says, it must mean that the Schitim that the wheat grows specially in this forest, and because it grows like that, it grows specially well. It's so well known. That was this other explanation. So here we're getting a little behind the scene action. Rashi didn't know what the text meant. One student said one way, one student said another way. Okay, you got all that? Okay. Now, we're coming back to Mikros Gedolos. The Mikros Gedolos that we have printed, the standard one of the Varsha one, did us a mix-up. He brought us Lo Yadati Mahu, and then he brought Rashi's second explanation, the one about that it's based on the psikta, that it means Menyanim Harbe. That's fine. But then the printed text brought Lo Yadati Mahu, and that's not good because that's Rashi number 1. You understand? Once you have Rashi number 2, you don't need Rashi number 1. But he made a tirkovet. He mixed up two texts that you don't need the first one anymore. And finally, in the printed text, it has that Mipi Reb Shimon, and it really is an Ishmaya Shematzati. So this was my first introduction into Toldot Rashi. So in other words, I found that a text that had parte de satre in your printed text could be solved when you get into the nitty-gritty of the manuscripts. You could see the actual history of what happened with Rashi. First, he didn't know it. Then he did know it. He had 2 students who tried to figure it out. I will tell you something else. After I did that, a few years later, I was invited to edit the whole parish of Rashi and Yechezkel for Mikros Gedolos HaKeter. So that was like another whole edition, not one verse. We're dealing with 48 chapters. I will tell you, I will not go into the whole thing. You can read it in the book. But I will tell you that the Rashi on Yechezkel is particularly complicated. When I was doing that, I actually found that there were close to 60 manuscripts Rashi and Yechezkel. When I did my actual text, the way that we work in Mikrot Gedolos HaKeter, we narrowed it down to about 7, using one as the base text and the other ones as the other ones to check it out. But when I had really, really complicated cases, I then went to check all 60. But I will tell you this, without going into all the details. Rashi in the printed text has many editions of not Rashi. And if you look at my edition of Mikros Gedolos HaKeter, you will see that all those editions I put in square brackets and a smaller font. So visually you can see the original Rashi and those things that were added to it. Okay, that's the beginning.
Yes, and that's really fascinating. So now I think it's worth to roll back, and not roll back, that's how you got into it, to talk about Rashi on the Torah. And this really goes nicely with you being, doing the work on the first Mikros Gedolos printed by Bomberg. And this, I recall, you mentioned Professor Grossman. I read Professor Grossman's book on Rashi a number of years ago. That's in English. And I think he says, Rashi 10 to 20%, as I recall. You'll correct me. I'm sure you know the numbers. And Al Torah is not Rashi. It's editions that aren't Rashi, and we have it printed as Rashi. So I think it's worthwhile to explain to the listeners an overview of the printed text of Rashi on Chumash and Al Torah, and really more than that, and how it got to where it is and how this came to be. We can talk maybe at the end. You talk about the canonization of Rashi, but just in general, the text that we have that everyone says Rashi says X and Y.
Okay, so let's first talk about Rashi on the Torah, then I'll get to Rashi on the Tanach. First of all, you have to know that in the printed text, we talk about incunabula, and that's those early printed texts till 1500. And we have 9 editions of Rashi in the incunabula edition, plus a 10th that was recently found, which I dealt with, and I deal with that in the book, on the 10th edition. It's only part of it is found. But you should know that in the incunabula period, usually when they printed a text, they used a different manuscript. It wasn't like later editions, one copies the other. But in that earlier part, like each editor, if one guy's doing it in Spain, one guy's doing Italy, each one's using a manuscript that he has in front of him. Although in certain incunabula editions, one edition may have influenced another one. However, there's a lot of variance going on already in that incunabula business because they're using different manuscripts. Then we have the 16th century. We have the 2 Mikros Gedolos of 1517 and 1525. And the 1525 was actually on Rashi was based a lot on 1517, but the 1525 edition became like what we call the Textus Receptus. That became like the popular text that most people were using. However, it's interesting because Rashi was very popular. I'm telling you that it's very interesting. When it came to Tanach, there were two editions called Hamagid, one in 1623-27 and one in 1699. And the one in 1623-27, he found another manuscript of Rashi. So he says, I'm going to edit, but I'll make some additions and changes. So in his edition, he starts adding parentheses, writing Samach Aleph Sefer Acher, Samach Aleph Aleph Sefer Acher Enenu, and then it starts getting complicated in the text, and you don't know exactly what's going on. Now, over the years, other scholars tried to fix or correct Rashi every once in a while in the Torah. There's Yosef Dat, there are other people, Barakat, etc. But it wasn't until the 19th century that Abraham Berliner, in 1866, actually tried to do a critical edition of Rashi on the Torah. He used 7 manuscripts, and he wrote in the margins, in the bottom, he would write the variants. That was his first attempt. And he also wrote the Makoros that Rashi used. Berliner kept on working, and much later in 1905, he made a second edition. In the second edition, he went from 7 to 100. He now looked at 100 manuscripts. The only problem was, as he says, I have so many manuscripts, I can't tell you which ones they are. And not only that, he says, there's so many, I can't bring you the variants in the bottom. So basically, although Berliner's edition of 1905 is very popular and is very well known, it cannot serve in today's criteria of a critical edition because he doesn't tell you what manuscripts he used and he doesn't tell you what the variants are. Now, because I would say that in today's context, we have 2 editions that are serviceable. One is the Mikrot Gedolot HaKeter, because they have, that's a big edition. It went from 1992 to 2019. It took them that long to finish the whole Tanach. And they have edited anew all the medieval commentators based on manuscripts. They've done a very nice job. There is one problem, is that he doesn't actually bring you the variants in a apparatus. Nevertheless, it's quite a good edition. The other very good edition is Hillel Novetsky's Ala Torah, which is available on the internet. On the Torah, he used as his base text Lepizig 1. And Brachus, he actually did a critical edition, and he used compared with other manuscripts, and he brings those variants in his edition. Now, throughout the Tanakh, he has done, with respect to Rashi, some of the books are done a complete critical edition, and some are waiting to be done. The great thing about the Ala Torah is he has not only done medieval commentators, he's brought it up to even modern ones. He includes all the way up to Shadal, for example, Shmuel David Sato, and lots, really amazing amount of work there. Kol HaKavod. So those were those 2 editions. Now I want to tell you something about Nach. Nobody tried to do what Berliner did for the Torah on the Nach. Part of the reason, I think, is Nach was a lot less learned than the Torah, as you know. Most people were doing Torah weekly, but not so much Nach. However, in the 1930s, there was a gentleman called Isaac Marsan from Denmark, and he did 3 editions, the Treasar, Yeshayahu, and Tehillim. And then there was a break for a long time. And then all of a sudden, there was a resurgence. In the last 30 years or so, we have seen a number of editions that are quite good of Rashi and Tanach. Katzenellenbogen did Yoshua, Shoftim, and Shmuel. Brian O'Leary did Shmuel. Avram Levi did the Pirkei HaMikdash of Yechezkel. Meir Gruber did Tehillim, but he only did it based on 1 manuscript. Avigdor Arieli and Avram Shoshana did Eov. That was a complicated story. My own student, Lisa Fredman, did an excellent job on Tehillim, and excuse me, on Mishlei, excellent. And User Rosenthal did it on Shira Shirim. Gila Rosen did it on Kohelet, and that's where we are now. One last thing I will tell you, Rashi is so popular that there were enormous amounts of super commentaries on Rashi. In other words, Perush on the Perush. There are so many commentaries on Rashi on the Torah that there are actually 2 articles that just summarized all the commentaries. For example, Yisrael Shapira did an article and he listed 143 super commentaries on Rashi. That just gives you an idea. On the other hand, the Tanach, there's almost no super commentaries on Rashi at all. That just gives you an idea.
I think in the book you also mentioned the sheer number of manuscripts on a Torah versus Nach. I mean, the difference is, you mentioned Yechezkel when you were working. By the way, I think you left out your edition of Yechezkel. It's in a keter of Rashi. When you went through Yechezkel, you had 60 manuscripts, but on Torah there's a few hundred. I mean, and Yechezkel there's a lot. There's some of those.
So let's talk about the number of manuscripts. In the Torah, back in the 1930s, Blundheim wrote an article in the Revue des Études Juives in 1931, and if you read through his article well, you can see there are at least 240 manuscripts of Rashi on the Torah. Now, just to give you an extreme opposite example, the famous Rashbam, Rashi's grandson. There's exactly one manuscript of Rashbam, and it was in Breslau. And in the World War II, it's lost. We don't even have that one manuscript. So that sheer number of manuscripts of Rashi on the Torah has actually caused people to stay away of trying to do a critical edition, because who wants to look at 240 manuscripts? In fact, somebody tried to start doing an edition. Philip tried to do on Leviticus, started with 40 manuscripts, and along the way, the budget got lost, so that edition was finished. Now, when it comes to Tanach, I will tell you, we don't have 240, but nevertheless, we have somewhere between 40 and 60 manuscripts on every book in Tanach. You can find it in my book, because in my book I've gone through these books like Yoshua and Melachim and Habakkuk and Mishlei and Amos and all these other books. And as I said, Yechezkel, and I have them listed. You can all find what those manuscripts are. And even though it's not as many as the Torah, nevertheless, it's much more than any other medieval commentator. It just shows you how much he was studied in ages. The closest guy who did well, Radak, in Yechezkel had like 32, which was a lot. Not 60, but 32, which is pretty good. But other fellows in Yechezkel had like 32, and some at 10, or they had 1. So it was Rashi who was really the major fellow with numbers, with manuscripts.
Yeah, now on Torah we have other commentaries end up with a number, Ralbag, Ibn Ezra, whatever, but way less. I mean, not like he's mentioned, there was extreme of the Rashbam. So another thing about Rashi that we should, emphasize here is, first of all, there's no handwriting, there's no manuscript of Rashi. So when we say Kisvayat, it's copied. But let's talk about what's the number one, or the earliest and the most important, the Lepizig one, and if you want to explain what that is and why it's so important.
Okay, let's talk about Lepizig 1. Actually, this is a manuscript about the 13th century. It contains the Torah, Targum Onkelos, and Rashi. The scribe was Mochi bar Karshavia, and Mochi bar Karshavia was very lucky. He had in front of him a copy of Rabbeinu Shmaya's copy of Rashi's commentary, which is quite good. Now, the thing that is absolutely fascinating about Lepizig, first of all, I must tell you, already Abram Berliner had mentioned Lepizig 1, although Abram Berliner never saw Lepizig 1 and never read it. Whatever information he got, somebody copied it for him. And Berliner said, it's difficult to read, so here's what I'm telling you and what I bring you. And then after Berliner wrote, then this whole topic sort of went to sleep. And all of a sudden, in 1991, it woke up again. Why? Because Professor Avram Grossman wrote an article in Tarbitz, and he informed everybody, guess what? Berliner only brought about a quarter of the material that was sitting there in the Leipzig 1 manuscript. And in fact, as Grossman said, there are 3 sets of notes there with respect to Rashi. There are notes that are haghos of Rashi himself. There are haghos of Shmaya, the student that we mentioned so many times, and there are notes of Machir himself, the scribe. Now, what's interesting is Shmaya always, when he brings Rashi's text, Machir will always tell you at the end of a note that he's quoting, he will write, for instance, Chav Chav Reishin, Kach Kosav Rabbeinu Shmaya. So you know that Machir is citing from the manuscript. Now, I have to tell you that when Grossman said that it was very difficult, he himself said it's very difficult to read the microfilm. So I said, you know what? I'm going to go to Leipzig and read the manuscript. So in fact, I did go to Leipzig, and I spent a month there reading the manuscript. And guess what? The manuscript is very nice to read, not like the microfilm, which is like yucky. If it was an old microfilm, it was very hard to read, but the manuscript was a pleasure. So it was just wonderful. And at the end of my big trip there in Leipzig, so then I pulled out 82 haghos of Rashi, and then I published those, and now you can find them in the book. Because that was the first time that the people had the full perspective of what Rashi haghos on his commentary. And the thing that's amazing, it's all sitting in one manuscript. Okay, now, I want to add at this time that there are 2 other sets of notes in that manuscript that are also very important. One set of notes, very interesting, really, this Machir he described was really something else. He quotes regularly the Mesorah Gedola Shekosav Rabbeinu Gershom Maor Hagola, and the Mesorah Gedola Shekosav Menachem Mizrani. Menachem Mizrani was a student of Rabbeinu Tam. So we have, it's absolutely fascinating. And Rabbeinu Gershom is like the 10th century, Rabbeinu Menachem Mizrani is 12th century. So we have here this information and from the Mesorah Gedola. And I will tell you that based on these notes, I was able to identify another manuscript in Hala of Ochla, which is Masoretic notes, and to prove that it was a Menachem Mizrani who was the editor. That's that very briefly. The other set of notes that are very important, this is unbelievable, really. This Machir is quoting regularly Basefer Shekosav Rabbeinu Gershom Oragola, Basefer Shekosav Menachem Mizrani, Basefer Shekosav Rameir, probably Meir Speyer. What does this mean by Sefer? This means that Machir is citing codices, that's manuscripts, that Rabbeinu Gershom wrote, Rabbi Menachem Mizrani wrote, or Meir. That's Bible manuscripts. This is unbelievable. Why is it unbelievable? Because he's quoting manuscripts, Ashkenazi manuscripts from the 10th century and the 12th century. We do not have today surviving Ashkenazi manuscripts from the 10th century or the 12th century. And here we have this material from Machir citing it, and based on that, I was able to reconstruct what was going on. Let's come back to Rashi. That's what our topic is. Okay. How do we know in Leipzig 1 that we have haghos from Rashi? I kept on saying, we have haghos from Rashi. How do we know that? The answer is very interesting. Rabbeinu Shmaya, every time that he had a haghah from Rashi, he would write at the end what I call an inscription. Sometimes it'd be very short. It would be just Reish, Rabbi. Or sometimes Mem Reish, Mipi Rabbi, right? Rabbi meaning Rashi, right? And sometimes it gets even more explicit. He would say, Sivani Rebbe Lahagia, right? Rebbe told me to make this correction, okay? So, and by the way, other students of Rashi, like the Rivan, who was his son-in-law, Rabbi Yehuda ber Natan, he also cites, when he, in his material, he also cites Rashi like that, Mipi Rabbi, Rabbi, Kener ala Rabbi, etc., etc. The other thing that's very interesting that I find fascinating about these notes in the Lepizig 1 manuscript is it allows us to peek into the yeshiva of Rashi and listening to the conversation between Rashi and his students. Listen to this. In Bamidbar, we have the following note. This is the addition. It starts off like this. Mashu Hukshali. What this was a difficulty that someone asked me. And at the end of this long Tosefet, we have the following note. Tshuvat Mori l'Reb Yehuda b'Reb Avraham. This whole long note is in effect an answer that Rashi gave to the student Reb Yehuda b'Reb Avraham. And here it is in the manuscript. Unbelievable. We're sitting there right in the yeshiva there that the student asked Rashi a question and he gave an answer. Or, for example, in Bamidbar, we have the following note. Omar lanu upiresh lanu Rabbi. Right? He's telling me, here's Rashi explaining it. I'll give you another one. In Yehoshua, now I'm leaving Leipzig for a minute. In Yehoshua, in another manuscript, in the chapter 22, after Rashi brings his explanation, in some of the manuscripts there's a big addition, and at the end of the addition we have the following note. Tosefet me Reb Yehuda b'Reb Avraham v'Rabbi Modeh, which means Reb Yehuda b'Avraham gave an alternate explanation to the verses that Rashi had explained. And they're telling us here that Rashi agreed that the student's parish was better than his. That's what he means by modeh. Or, for example, in Hosea, we have the following note. This is like unbelievable. It's like we're in a microphone. V'hayom Amar Rabbi. This is what Rabbi explained today in the yeshiva. Or in Amos again, we have an addition, and it says Tosefet the Rabbi Modeh. I will add another point to you. We all know about Rabbi Yosef Kara, who was like an older contemporary of Rashi, but also like a student. And already Berliner brought 3 notes in Breishis. I'll quote you 1 or 2. Listen to this, unbelievable. For Rabbi Yosef Kara Zal, Mefaresh be'inyan acher. He's explaining this text a little different from Rashi. And at the end of the note, it says like this. V'hodeh hamoreh lidvarav. Rashi, agreed that his parish is better than his own. One other case, for example, in Breishis again, for Reb Yosef Kara Piresh, v'maor hagadol ne Yisrael modelo. Right, so we see, Rashi is a great exegete, but we should all learn from him. When you find that somebody's other parish is better than yours, and you think and you agree to it, it's very nice that you can say that. Let me give you one last case, and then you'll go on. In Yoshua, this is absolutely amazing. In Yoshua, there's a bunch of cases where we have the tribes are mentioned and which cities they each got. And in this case in Yoshua, they usually give a summary of what number of cities they got, and then they spell out what the cities are. The problem is every once in a while, the number that's given and the actual number of cities that are given don't agree one another. And Rashi brought such a contradiction once and explained it. But then I found in the manuscripts that Rabbeinu Shmaya pointed out to Rashi a problem. He said, hey, look, over here also, here's the number they're giving, but the number doesn't agree with it. And then Rabbeinu Shmaya suggested an answer to Rashi, but what does Rabbeinu Shmaya says? I love it. It says, the Rebbe Megamgem, which means in medieval language, it means mefakpek. In other words, he doesn't like my explanation so much. He didn't think it's so good. And then I looked at further manuscripts and I found that Rashi gave his own explanation. Okay, let's continue.
I think what's really amazing about all of this is that we have this kind of intimate look at what's going on with Rashi and his students. And a lot of Rishonim, we don't have this. And Rashi say it's Rabban Shal Yisrael, and he's Rashi, but he written Ruch Kodesh, right? And Rashi is he's agreeing, saying to students, this is better. I should change this. I'm editing this, telling students, you go edit this. You really see the kind of the work that's going on. And so this is something, and by the way, all of this and much more is in the book, which is about, let me just look at it, it's almost 600 pages. And in brief, for listeners, I remember Grossman's book on Rashi does mention, Lepizig, he does mention all this in like brief, just to get like an overview. So I think a question though to ask is, how did we end up though with our text that we have today, the text that's kind of everywhere, that's all over? Does that setting that text more or less in stone, so to speak? Does that start with Makres Gedolos in Bomberg's edition? Is that where that starts, and then it gradually they make some additions here? There's some of the later.
What you said, that part is correct. But as I said today already, now we are fortunate enough to have two editions that we can do much better with the Makres Gedolos HaKeter and Ala Torah, because now we know we have to look at manuscripts. What I would like to do with you now at this point is to give you a few examples of Rashi's haghos on Tanach. And as I said to you, oftentimes it's very short. Oftentimes the note will only say Mipi Rabbi or Rabbi. But I want to bring you a few cases where the proof for his haghos is much, much more explicit. Listen to this. This is amazing. I'll bring you a few examples. In Yechezkel Chaf Aleph, at the end of the chapter, Rashi, and this is even in the printed edition, Rashi brings a perush, and after he finishes the perush, we have the following sentence. Listen to this. Ze yamim rabim shepirashti parsha zu kasher ketuva. עכשיו הבנתי בשינוי לשונות שבה שאין הנביא מדבר אלא על החרב. Which means, Rashi says, listen, for some time now, I explained this text in way number one, but now I understand it has a different meaning. And then Rashi goes on to explain it according to the new meaning. And even in your Makres Gedolos, if you look at the end of chapter 21, you're going to find both additions, like Rashi number 1 and Rashi number 2 after he understood when he corrected. That's one example. Here's another example. This is unbelievable. After Rashi finishes his commentary on Yechezkel, he sent it out to Oxer, which is Altsura, which is not too far from Troyes. And then the Chacham over there sent back to Rashi a list of questions. He said, listen, Rashi, I have the following questions, A, B, C, D. And in question number 10, he said, look, you contradicted yourself in what you said. In verse this, you said X, but in verse Y, you said this, and it's a contradiction. And here's what Rashi answers in Tshuva number 10. Umikol makom ani ta'iti boto perush. V'satru dvarai ze et ze. V'ata asakti bai machenu shmaya v'gatiha. Right? This is unbelievable. He says, yes, I agree. I have actually contradicted myself. But now I have reviewed my commentary with Rabbeinu Shmaya, and I have corrected it. And I will add to you briefly without going to it. If you look at the manuscripts, you can see Rashi before the correction and Rashi after the correction. By the way, I will add that these tshuvas of Rashi, the first one who printed them was Berliner in a special book. Then Elfenbein in his tshuvas Rashi printed at the beginning. But not all people who deal with Tanach know Elfenbein's thing. So I have edited those tshuvas, and you will find them at the back of my edition in the Makres Gedolos of HaKeter Yechezkel. You'll find Rashi's tshuvas there on Yechezkel. Okay, another example. In Habakkuk, this is very interesting. There's a verse that said, Ki od chazon lamoed. Now there is a thought in Chazal that says that Shnot Galut, the number of years of the diaspora, are keneged snot ikiyum mitzvat shmita, are comparable to the number of years that they did not do the mitzvat shmita. Now, Rashi in Habakkuk, on that verse, goes out of his way trying to figure out, to show how the number of Shnot Galut equals the Shnot of Ikiyum Mitzvat Shemitah. It's a very detailed thing. I won't go into the computation, but here's what I want to tell you. I looked at all the manuscripts here, and in the cover of the book, I brought a text, and this is what the text reads. Kula maskena de milta, kemoshe taktia kan, kachi gia mori bekuntriso. What does that mean? In this manuscript, you find two versions of how to calculate those years. And the one, what he's saying here, he's saying, look, the one that I brought you right now, this is what Rashi corrected in his own commentary, and this is the correct one. So in fact, what we have here again, there's a Rashi 1 and a Rashi 2. By the way, I will tell you that in most printed editions, they have the second correct one. But they don't tell you that it's corrected edition. You have to look in their manuscripts to see the two editions. Let me give you another case. This is very interesting. In Melachim Aleph, you know there are the details of Shlomo building the Mikdash. It's very complicated, this stuff. There's architecture explaining how it goes. In one of the verses, in Perek Zayin, Umul Mechazel Mechazeh, Rashi at the end of his commentary writes, Ve'eni yodea heich. I don't know exactly how this worked out. I don't know. Now guess what? Again, we're coming into the yeshiva, because I looked at several manuscripts, and all of a sudden in several manuscripts you find the following addition. Listen to this. B'mashkana de Melachim Piresh Rabbi Pam Shnia. In other words, when Rashi taught the Shia the second time around, he figured out what he didn't know the first time around. So you can find in some manuscripts that whole business about Mechazeh, you have a whole piece where he's explaining it, what it meant, which is a very nice case. Let me add one last thing here. This your readers probably, or your listeners don't know about too much. Rashi also drew certain illustrations in his commentary. Now, the reason why many readers don't know this is because most of these illustrations do not show up in the printed editions. Why? I guess it's a little more complicated to do illustrations. A lot easier to set, Hebrew text and not add all the extra illustrations. But now I'll bring you a proof. First of all, I will tell you that in the Yechezkel commentary, there are two illustrations, and they deal with the Pirkei HaMikdash. And in my edition for Mikros Gdolos HaKeter, you will find both illustrations in the back of the Perush on Yechezkel. Now, I will now bring you a proof. By the way, those illustrations show up in at least 19 manuscripts. So it's 100% Rashi. But I'm going to bring you another proof. This is a wonderful proof about how Rashi did illustrations. Remember, I told you about the tshuvas that Reb Shmuel Meokser wrote to Rashi. So in tshuva number 9, Reb Shmuel Meokser said, "Listen, Rashi, you explained X, Y, and Z, but I really don't understand what you wrote there." And here's what Rashi writes: "Eini yodea lohosif al ma shepirashti bakuntras." I really can't explain any better. But aktsuratam atsur veshlachlo. But I'm going to draw you a picture and I'll send it to you. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So if you get my picture, you'll be able to understand this even better. Now, guess what? I have been fortunate to locate that picture. This is unbelievable. And remember, this was a picture that Rashi sent to this Rav Shmuel Meltzer. But Avram Avigail pointed out this picture to me, and immediately I understood that this picture was from the picture that Rashi said he would send in Tshuva number 9, and in my edition of Yechezkel of Mikros Gol Sakete, you will find that picture. It exists in one manuscript in St. Petersburg. So there you have it. If you look at the end of the edition, you will find that very picture. And now I will add one more super interesting point. A number of scholars have pointed out that Rashi's commentary influenced in the 12th century on the non-Jews in Paris, especially in Saint Victoire. There were 3 people there: Richard of Saint Victoire, Hugh of Saint Victoire, and Andrew of Saint Victoire. And the most fascinating thing is as follows. In the 90s, Walter Kahn and Gabriel Cedric Rajna, this is almost like unbelievable. They found that Richard of Saint Victoire, in his commentary on Yechezkel, where he brings many, many pictures concerning the Beit HaMikdash of Yechezkel, in several manuscripts, there is one of the pictures, and it's literally a copy of that picture of the second illustration of Rashi and Yechezkel. In other words, it's Richard of Saint Victoire is bringing the same illustration that Rashi had, which shows you that this Richard of Saint Victoire, somebody showed him this picture of Rashi, and he copied it there. Absolutely fascinating. Okay.
Really amazing. And I mean, you have all this and more again in the book. In the book, besides for this, things discussed generally, there's also nitty-gritty stuff in there. A lot of the manuscript work, which is really fantastic. And if someone's interested in Rashi, reading about Rishonim and manuscripts, must buy the book. And I'll link to the book in the show's notes. It's Masad Bialik. They could ship to America, so I'll put that information in there. I'll also link to Al Torah, as you mentioned. Keter Chumash is published by Bar Ilan. Al Torah by Hillel Novesky is fantastic. Anyone interested in learning Chumash and you really want to go through, like you said, there's many commentaries there and midrashim, and it's all you can use their Makres Gedolos, so everything comes on one pasuk, and you just click on the one that you want.
And it's online.
Yeah, it's all online. It's great. So I'll link to that, and you can check that out.
By the way, actually, Mikros Gedolos Keter is also online.
Oh, okay. So if I can find a link, I'll add that link as well. We'll put that in my notes to add. But and one other thing is Rashi. So we mentioned Rashi's haghos, but what about the other way? What about the Rashi that again, people should go there for the text, but for the standard Chumash and the standard Rashi that most listeners are going to be used to, how much in there would you say is not Rashi, and how can we not how do we know? What are there some examples? I remember one of the famous ones, Im Lavon Garti, Targum Shamarti, is not Rashi, but what are some others that perhaps listeners aren't familiar, and how much is there a percentage that isn't Rashi? Probably that it's one of his students.
Well, again, the way to solve that, if your listeners really want to see it, if you really look at Mikros Gedolos HaKeter, you will see that the additions that are not Rashi are printed in square brackets in a smaller font, so you can see it visually right away. And also in Al HaTorah, you'll be able to see that. So you have two good kalim to see what's not Rashi. Another famous one is, for example, at the end of Vayomas Terech Bechoron, and it says Nunzu Hafucha, etc., etc. That whole comment is not by Rashi. In the manuscripts, it's by Reb Aaron, some other guy. Oh, I must add this to you for your listeners. This is brand new. This is unbelievable. Even ArtScroll has now begun to print a new edition of Rashi. It's called the Elucidated Rashi. And if you look there at the back of the edition, there is a section in Hebrew called Siftei Chachamim. and even in Art Scroll, they are beginning to list variants based on 7 manuscripts, and he's pointing out there, right, things that are not Rashi, things that are Rashi, things that are problematic, things that are Rabbi Yosef Kara, et cetera, et cetera. So even there, and that they continue doing that. So there is still hope that people will find what is Rashi and what is not Rashi. And if you look at my book, you'll find that also.
Yeah, in your book, there's an extensive bibliography. You have extensive indices, so it's very useful. You want to buy the book, and you want to just check something out. You don't have to just some of these books they don't have that, and so you're busy. Where would I be able to find this in Professor Penkower's book? Well, here you'll be able to find it right away. And if you want to read up on Rashi, Rashi on Tanach, to be clear, not Rashi on Gemara. That there's still stuff coming out also. Professor Ren just put out another volume on Beitza this time, I think.
Correct.
There's been a bunch of volumes on that, but this is different. So, yeah, if you want to read more about Rashi on Tanakh, like I said, Professor Grossman's book, Rashi book in English, for those that want to read English, is like a general overview, and he does touch on some of this. But if you really want to really know what's going on, yes, buy your book and check that out. So I'll link to that in the show's notes for the listeners, and hopefully they found this interesting and enlightening, and learn more about Rashi. And Rashi is Rabbi Shal Yisrael is the most used commentary until today, but there's many things about Rashi that readers and listeners don't know, and it'll be helpful for them to really know what's Rashi and what's not Rashi. And also, being as a lot of what you laid out here with all those examples, Rashi is unique in this way that we can see him editing it and removing things, and his students adding, and we see the interaction between him and his students. We don't see that when you comes to the Ramban or the Ibn Ezra. It's totally different. So
absolutely. Hey,
okay.
I will add just what Ramban, because my colleagues, Professor Ofer and Professor Jacobs, put out a very good book on Ramban on the Torah, right? Where Ramban, when he came to Eretz Yisrael, then he made a lot of corrections, and that's listed in 2 sets of manuscript, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, Tesefes Ramban Lepirusha L'Torah Shenichtavu Be'eretz Yisrael, and that's published by Herzog. Really, also another. You're right. I did forget about that. A fascinating book. Just pulled it off my shelf over here, so it's that's well worth getting as well. So one more thing I would ask you to finally. So is the book just a collection of all your articles, not just with the bibliography and the indices and everything put together now as a sefer, or is there anything new that you added in here, or is it?
So first, I just want to say that the book per se is not just a collection of articles, but it's basically a monograph on Rashi, on the Torah and Nevi'im, etc. I have added a little bit, not too much. I found some more haghos in Yoshua. Actually, Hil Novetsky pointed out to me a few which I added there, and I also added a few in Amos. I perhaps I updated a little bit some of the notes, but it's all been corrected very carefully. There's been, how did I say, b'sheva einayim. The text should be very, very accurate in this edition. I will add one last thing for some of the readers who may be interested. At the very back of the book, the Meftech Inyanim, the very, very end, among the indices, I have a thing that says Tziyunim hamatzbi'im al haga'ah me'et Rashi on page 558. Those are like inscriptions. Those are the keys that let you know that you have here a Haggadah of Rashi. And I have like 2 columns of such notes that makes it very easy to spot where you have these haghos.
Yeah, okay. There's so much in here. We just really talk generally, but like the specific chapters, I mean, I can just kind of tell listeners, you have a whole, in the beginning, you talk about the canonization of Rashi's commentary, which is fascinating. You talk about, a lot of what we discussed. You talk about the haghos, Rashi's haghos, others haghos in Kabbalah. You mentioned, then you go through extensively Nevi'im, using examples from Yecheskel, etc. Talk about Rashi and Eiv. Then there's a chapter on Shnei Chachamim Bepirushay Rashi LeTanach, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda Darshan. Then there's extensive bibliography. You have a list of Kisvei Yad, and then you go through, as we said, the indices and other things. And I'm just bouncing around. There's a whole bunch of entries that I didn't read. So there's really a lot in here. I'll link to it in the show's notes for listeners that are interested. And thank you, Professor Penkower, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.